Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. Welcome to a fairly special episode of Explained, as you might be able to tell by my Iron Throne-like setup here with kind of the light side versus dark side. Today we're going to be talking about how to squeeze the most value out of a new guitar rig. So this video is going to be assuming you're wanting to buy either a whole new setup with a new guitar and a new amplifier, or you're just looking for pieces of new gear. And really it's kind of a look into how I review products, how I think about buying my own stuff, because this is going to be a conversation about value, about what is value for an individual, and specifically how I assess it. So I actually went through kind of a similar exercise with a couple people recently that are just now starting to get into looking at electric guitar gear. And the conversation always circled back around to, well, you know, this might be a little more expensive, but I think you'll get more years out of this, or you'll have more headroom to grow, whereas you could save a couple $100 here, but you'll end up selling it because it doesn't do everything you want to do. And I kind of wanted to go through that process here. So what is value? I think what a lot of people have in their heads as being valuable is actually kind of skewed. So if you go to a big chain superstore, you might see, well, there's the value-oriented brand that is equivalent to the name brand, but it's like 30% less expensive. So a lot of people think, oh, well, cheaper is more value. No, cheaper is part of the equation to value, but value to me is a ratio. It's how much stuff do you get for the dollar that you spend. So it's, you know, the amount of features or the amount of uses or whatever is valuable to you over how much you pay for it. And that's where that subjectivity comes in. And there will be products where it may be valuable to one person and not to another, or one that is worth spending for someone and not for another. Subjectivity aside though, there are at least a few steadfast rules of thumb that you can kind of rely on when it comes to purchasing guitar gear, or about anything when it comes to entertainment in general. So for instance, let's say you have a $150 sporting rifle. It doesn't really make sense to put a $2,000 scope on that gun, in the same way that having a $2,000 rifle and a $150 scope on it probably also isn't the best way to be spending your money. It makes more sense to kind of meet in the middle to get better value out of both ends and make them a little more compatible in terms of what one is capable of enhancing the other. And it's the same thing with guitars. It doesn't really make sense to be playing a $3,000 custom shop guitar all the time through a $250 combo amp. Again, it's subjective. Maybe that's exactly what you want. Maybe you don't really care about the amp features. Maybe you just want to play a high-end guitar and noodle around. In the second half of this video, I'll go over some budget tiers and what I would buy if I were, you know, limited to that amount of spending money on a guitar and amp setup. Because I wanted to cover both at the same time, I'm actually going to make the guitars and amps cost pretty much the same. That way, if you are only looking for one side of that, you can almost just divide these budgets by two and be pretty much all the way there. As I kind of go up the budget list though, you'll see I tend to skew more of my money towards the amps and effects side than the guitar side. I feel like the ceiling for the amount of features, the amount of value you get that can be objectively quantified really is around that $1,500 range when it comes to guitars, although it keeps growing for amps and effects. So that's another one of those rules of thumb. Another thing to keep in mind is that the used market is always a good idea if you're comfortable with it and if what you're looking for is even available. For instance, some lower volume pedal companies, you may just not find a used version on the market because they're so scarce. And if you do, that scarcity may drive the price higher than it would cost new in a lot of cases, especially if they've been discontinued entirely. But for most mass manufactured stuff, especially on this side of the camera, you can kind of rely on the used version to be about 70% of the cost. It's not always true, but when we're talking about mass manufactured guitars or combo amps, or especially effects pedals, you can more or less count on saving upwards of 30% on the used version. That's not always true. Sometimes they do hang closer to the new pricing. Sometimes they absolutely obliterate the new pricing. If you've got like a really popular amp head that's kind of flooded the market, then you might have to sell it for, 50% less than what you bought new. So it is a bit variable, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb that anywhere in that 70% plus or minus a few percent range is probably what you're going to end up spending. So a lot of the times you can actually kind of jump up a tier of gear if you're willing to, be patient, try out some used stuff. Say you're in the $500, area and looking for a new amplifier. Well, you can actually probably look at the $650 to $700 amplifiers new and find that used and end up paying the same thing. And that's a good move if that has more of the features you like, or you just like the sound better, all that good stuff. Before we get into some of those budget lists, let's take a look at some of the items I have here on display and talk about how they kind of fall into the whole value conversation. So for guitars, here I have the Fender Modern Player Telecaster. This thing gets a lot of airtime on this channel. I end up using it a lot for demonstrations because of one of the great features. It actually has like 6 pickup sounds in total. You got 3 single coil sounds, 2 hum canceling, and 1 humbucker. And that makes it have a lot of value for me, both in terms of just wanting to play a single guitar and be able to flip through tones. The other is you get all this packed into a package that new was only like $500 and some change, and you don't really sacrifice much else. It's obviously not the most gorgeous guitar on the market, and Fender custom shop stuff and a lot of their American made stuff will have a little better quality in terms of materials and maybe even construction. But for $500 you get the setup was great, level frets, good action, it sounds good, it plays good. This is a great value product for me. Now, if you don't like Telecaster shapes, or if you want a humbucker on the neck or some of these other things that simply aren't compatible with this guitar, then no, this doesn't have all that much value. But for a large portion of the market, this is what really epitomizes a good value product. On the polar opposite end of the spectrum, we have the NOF Custom Super Typhoon that Onofre built for me, and this is anything but a crowd pleaser for many reasons. And custom guitars, low volume stuff like this is really not going to have a lot of value for most people. For me, it has a ton of value because it has all of these features that I wanted out of a production guitar that didn't exist. It has a body that ultimately I helped design. It has, custom hardware that I was dreaming about 10 years ago. But for most people that just want a good 8-string guitar sound, this isn't the way to go. You're better off waiting for a more mass manufactured model from, say, NOF that does a lot of this stuff that, maybe you don't need a neck through construction. You probably don't need this particular kind of bridge. And when we're talking about an instrument whose tuning machines and pickups alone cost more than this entire guitar here, then obviously this is something that you should just strike from your list entirely if you are concerned about getting the most value for your dollar. Again, it's not something that you should never buy. For me, that was at a point where this is exactly what I want, and it was worth everything for me, and especially at the price, it was competitive versus what other companies are offering, and it's right up my alley. But you can't say it's valuable to a big portion of the market. You'll see a similar thing in the effects pedal market as well, with stuff like the Boss Super Overdrive. This pedal new is $50. You can find them as low as like $30 to $35 on the used sites. And this basically does everything a tube screamer does for high gain amp players. If you were worried about clean tones and that kind of break up sound through a clean amplifier, this isn't exactly the best bet, but it can kind of do a similar thing. And most importantly, for those of you that watch this channel for the metal tones, which I'd imagine is a lot of you, I think this does a better job. So when you're only spending, a half or a third of what a name brand Maxon or Ibanez tube screamer is going for, and it's way cheaper, that's value in a great package. Obviously, some people like, oh, I don't like the mustard yellow, or maybe don't like the Boss aesthetic if you're worried about that, but those are kind of things you really shouldn't if you are worried about getting good value out of your rig. On the other end of the spectrum, we have these low volume single use pedals like the Fort and Grind, and all this thing does is drive a high gain amplifier into full-blown overdrive, kind of cuts off some of your lower frequencies to make down-tuned guitars sound better. But compared to the Super OD, this is a one-trick pony, and it goes for $250 new, and about that used. this is one of those instances where there's not all that many out there, so they kind of retain their price, especially dwarfed by the millions of pedals that, Boss has sold. So in that way, this is not a good, way to spend your money. For 250 bucks, you can get some full-blown amplifiers. You can especially jump from a decent tier of amp to a great amp with $250 more. I like this pedal a lot, and it does a lot for me, but it's not the most economically viable way to be upgrading your guitar rig. Now let's say you are playing through a more traditional amplifier head and you're on the hunt for a speaker cabinet. 9 times out of 10, I'm always going to recommend a 2x12 versus a 4x12. 2x12s are kind of that sweet spot in terms of size, portability, weight, and sound, to where on recordings in the room, they don't sound so drastically different from a 4x12, but they still have much more body, much more resonance, much more of the rock guitar sound we all like than a 1x12 does. In general, a 2x12 cab is usually in the 60 to 70% price range of the equivalent 4x12, meaning that you are technically paying more per speaker, but you've got these fixed costs like the cabinet and the shipping and all this stuff that is going to play into why there's a bit of a premium. But especially with something like this, there's 2 high power 75 watt speakers that gives you enough power handling for even a full-blown, say, 120 watt head, and it sounds great. I mean, this thing really can stand toe-to-toe with a lot of 4x12 cabinets. Whereas something like this 4x12, specifically a Mesa oversized rectifier cabinet, is north of $1,000 new, and they can keep going depending on who's making them and what the speakers are in it. So for me, if you don't want to break your back, if you want to save some poundage and some storage space and some room on stage, a 2x12 is a great compromise. So many professionals use them. They sound great recorded and live, and it's the obvious go-to. And with stuff like speaker cabinets, this is a good spot to try out used, because oftentimes the shipping is going to be a lot looking at stuff new online or even used at that rate. But you can often find them more easily at local music stores. You can try them out, visually inspect it, make sure there's no tears, and save quite a bit more. So, this used costs about 35 to 40% of what this would new, and still about half of what this would cost used. So far, this has been fairly cut and dry in terms of cheaper is better value. So let's talk about a couple instances where I think isn't necessarily the case. So with something like this now discontinued version of the Marshall MG series, this is the 250 DFX, I don't think this is a great way to be spending your money. There are better amps out there that for a little bit more cash can be more usable, have better effects, have better controllability, and that's my opinion. Obviously, some people, especially on the comments of the full demo of this amp, are like, yeah, that's more than enough for me, or that'd be great. The clean channel's super transparent, the overdrive would work with them with an external pedal, and that's all fine and dandy. For what I need it to do, you got to end up spending another 150 plus on external gear to make it sound the way I want, and then that already eradicates its value proposition. So there are plenty of amps in this category, in this class, that I think are of great value, but that is one of the things you got to watch out for with older stuff, is just because it's less expensive doesn't mean it's necessarily a better value. You get a lot of these features on stuff that is, half the cost of what this was new now. On the other hand, with something like this custom cherry tone amplifier, it's offering features that would cost almost double to achieve the same thing with a competing product. And at the very least, it would cost you almost as much, if not the same amount, to source the parts and materials yourself and then do the work and actually put it together. Now, that's not to say that this has value for everyone, just like with the previous example. If you have a $2,000 strict budget, it doesn't make sense to be spending 75% or more of that on just one part. But for those that are in the market for a plexi high gain style amplifier, then this does provide value in that context. And that's really the buzzword of the day, is context. It's putting all of these products into perspective, seeing how do they stack up against the comparable competition, because it's really not fair to directly compare something like this combo amp to something like this. They're just really miles apart in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And in that same way, something that is expensive can not be overpriced. It could be worth what it is in that context, in the same way that something that is budget oriented can still be overpriced for what you're paying. So you can see why this kind of gives reviewers fits in terms of, you know, do I just recommend this to everyone, or, you know, who is this actually going after? And with that, you got stuff like this mini amp gizmo, which is kind of an enthusiast product, you could really call it. Really, this whole side is sort of enthusiast based, but where you're spending a couple $100 on this box or more, you're spending a good chunk of change on a custom cable, but once you do so, if you've already got the rig that's compatible, you're actually unlocking more value in terms of being able to control parameters with MIDI that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And that's one of those things that if you don't need MIDI functionality, if you don't have all this high-end gear already, then this offers zero value. But if you do, and you've already spent a lot of money on this kind of stuff, then a couple $100 more with a specialized product like this can actually make it more worth having. Likewise, a used original Line 6 pod, or the 2.0, or especially if you're a dumbass like me who spent another like $30 to upgrade a 1.0 to a 2.3 firmware, is really not worth the money compared to what a later Gen Pod XT costs. You're looking at either the same price or at most $10 more for what a lot of them are going for, and you have so many more options, so many more amp models. By the time you download the free firmware, you can do stuff like use this as a USB interface for a direct recording guitar. You can reamp through it. You can record the DI signal. You've got stop box modeling, and all this is stuff that, you know, if you don't like the quality of it, if you don't like the sound, then it doesn't matter. You know, that's not value added. Maybe there are people out there who simply prefer the original pod sound. And I can kind of get that, because while this does have its problems, as we've talked about, it does have kind of an iconic thing going on. But in general, this is one of those examples where the older, more scarce, but less capable product is actually more expensive for what it is compared to the one that came later, has more features, and is more plentiful. So this is kind of one of those cautionary tales of just because something's cheaper, just because something may look really similar on the surface, doesn't necessarily mean that's the best buy. So keep all that in mind, do your research, and with that, let's talk about some of the budget tiers that I've assembled over the past few days. For this segment, I put together 5 different budget tiers ranging from $350 all the way up to $4 grand. Because at that point, if you're spending well over $4,000 on your collective guitar rig, then money probably isn't the absolute biggest worry for you in this case. You're probably more worried about what do I really like, what really suits me, and not necessarily can I get the absolute most bang for my buck. And then after that, I'm going to briefly touch on software budgets as well, since all of this is really going to be talking about people who want to play through physical stuff, but there is definitely a reason, definitely a use case for those of us that, you know, just want to bring a laptop to a gig, or maybe you're tied to a dorm room and you can't play out loud. So we'll cover all of that. But beginning with our entry level kind of bedroom budget is what I would call this, for $350 to $500. As you'll notice with a lot of these budgets, they do fluctuate, and specifically on the lower end, we're looking at a plus or minus, what, 20% swing, depending on what kind of guitar you buy, what kind of amp you buy. So the middle ground's about 400, but it can really take a hard swing depending on what you're going after for hardware. For guitar, I would spend no less than $200 on a new guitar today. And honestly, at that price, I would look for something that's a bit better used. You could find something like an equivalent Epiphone Les Paul studio type thing for around that price, and you know, maybe if you could stretch your budget just a little further, something that's a little further up in their tier list. But you got stuff like the budget ends on the Jackson Kelly, the Jackson Randy Rhoads stuff. I know Ibanez makes some lower end models, LTD, Super Strats in general. Just don't be expecting to get some Floyd Rose license bridge. You're looking at fixed bridges or string throughs with tunumatics, kind of the bottom of the barrel hardware on everything else. Maybe not the best pickups in the world, but my advice here would buy something that plays well, that sounds good enough, and you can always kind of stretch your legs if you save up another $100 or so, swap out the critical components like the pickups, maybe a good set of pots. If the tuning machines are particularly terrible, maybe that, but I'd go for like a nut upgrade or at least have it filed first. And, you know, spend a few bucks on a guitar tech to make sure the frets are leveled, all that. Then you can turn a lower end guitar into something that's a decent player. And that specifically becomes more valuable the higher you go. But if you're just starting out, get something that'll work and don't worry too much about it. For the amplifier rig, you're looking at anywhere from $100 and $229, which is why this budget can really swing. And it really depends on what you're going for. Do you want just to be able to plug in headphones and play in your bedroom without waking mom and dad at night? Then stuff like the Behringer V-Amp 3, which is almost an exact copy of the original pod, or even a brand new Line 6 Pocket Pod, which is something you could stick in your backpack and is actually based off of 2.0 architecture. Those come at 100 to 130 bucks. So if you're willing to compromise on the amps and effects, you can actually stretch your budget on the guitar a little more and get something that I think you can hang on to for a long time. Otherwise, if you want to start playing out loud, then you have stuff like the Roland Cube series at $140 and up. They're really capable. Obviously, you're not going to get like the best, you know, album quality metal guitar tone, but they have a lot of multi effects on board and plenty of distortion and crunch and clean sounds to where it's really good starting out and something that I think I could recommend. Now, let's say that you're just buying the amp only, or you've managed to get a really good deal on a guitar. Maybe you can stretch your budget all the way up to $229 for a Boss Katana 50, or if you find one used, and you know, you kind of balance it out that way. And that's another kind of critically acclaimed budget tier amplifier that's, you know, in the solid state realm, but still sounds very good, more than capable for practicing and learning. At this price point though, one of the things is it's really hard to find in that $200 region, especially not used, is a 12-inch speaker. So that's something you're pretty much going to have to make a compromise on. And that's something I'm not willing to compromise on. I started playing on like an 8-inch speaker, hated it, and that's why this was my next amp. So that is something that you can just pretty much cross off your wish list at this price. Moving on to the $700 to $800 rig. This is kind of the getting serious price point where, you know, I don't think you're going to be recording much with it. Not to say that you couldn't with some of this stuff, but this is like, you know, jamming in the garage with friends, maybe doing some gigs every now and then, high school kid that's getting some money and during summer, that kind of budget is what I'm thinking. So if you split it down the middle, guitars, that's about $400. And this is where stuff, you know, really starts to open up. You're looking at the higher end Squire range, some of which are more, you know, contemporary and built for modern guitarists. Still that higher end of budget Jacksons, lower to middle tier Epiphones or LTDs, and even some 7-strings start to come into play if you want to compromise a bit on the amp side, because a lot of them will start to sell for between $450 and $500. Again, used as a good option here because you might be able to find some of those fixed bridge 7-strings there. Probably not going to find much in the way of a baritone scale. Probably all going to be Fender scale 25.5-inch stuff. But if you're not super experienced with the guitar yet anyway, I think it's good to stay with that scale length. So there's a lot more options for guitarists, and especially if you're wanting to play more contemporary genres, I think this is the price point you need to start looking at. For amplifiers and amp modelers, this is where things start to get a bit more flexible. You've got, you know, dedicated amp modeling units like the Moore GE200 and the Line 6 Amplify FX100 at $300. I specifically like the tones from Moore better. Of course, that's not like the best gig ready rig considering its build quality, but you do have other things like the Hawtone Ampero, which actually I was really impressed with the sound. I'd like to play through one of those. Some other budget models include stuff like a Zoom G5N. Tech 21 has some fly rigs if you're not into that, you know, oh, I've got to construct my signal chain and all that. There's some of this just like, yeah, you want the drive sound, you want a delay or chorus, and they make some different ones based on that. In terms of an out loud traditional amplifier, of course, you have the Boss Katana 100, and you're starting to get into kind of a price tier where you can at least find a 1x12, which is so much better, in my opinion, than an 8 and 10-inch speaker for the rock and metal tones we're discussing. The great thing about this price tier in particular is compared to the $350 to $500 budget, a lot of this stuff you can really grow into. You know, obviously, stuff like the Pocket Pod or some of the direct sounds that you can get with the lower tier stuff isn't bad, because you can always have that as your practice rig or bedroom rig or whatever. But for the guitar specifically, at that $400 to $500 price point, I feel like that's where quality starts to pick up a bit. It's where that you can, you know, stretch your budget, make a few extra bucks, replace some of those critical components, get a good setup, and you have a guitar that you can really play on and sounds good with. It's a similar story with a lot of these amp modelers, where you could physically plug them into the effects return of an amplifier, say if you graduate into one, or if you're playing a gig at a friend's house, or at a place that has a backline, you can use it that way. And that's a big sticking point for value. It's how can you use these things in multiple use cases? Can you use it in just practicing, or can you take it to a stage and get good sounds that way? At $1,000 to $1,200, you're really looking at being able to seriously play, you know, get some gigs, play some local stuff, and have instruments that you can continue to grow in and record in, you know, in theory later on. So at around $600, you're looking at like the Paul Reed Smith SE line, some of the budget Fenders. Like I said, this is $500, so you're looking at some headroom there. Plenty of higher end Epiphone and LTD, and some of the lower end Ibanez stuff is in this region as well. And that's where you can start to find some of those more exotic pickups. Not, you know, you're not probably going to look at name brand stuff from EMG or especially Fishman Fluence, but you can get active pickup sounds and, you know, more of those traditional PAF sounds out of the vintage model guitars as well. The $600 amp price point finally starts to bring in some 2x12s on the solid state side, and even some tube driven combo amps if you're willing to spend just a little bit more. So at the less expensive Boss Katana 100 2x12s, $500. You've got the Boss Katana Artist 100 for $600. I would prefer to have the 2x12, but there are some features that maybe you find more useful on that. You've got stuff like the HD 500X at $550, or way less than that used if you can stand the Pod HD sound, and you're in HX Stomp or the amplifier territory for multi-effects units, which may not be up everyone's alley. Neither one of those, in my opinion, are the epitome of a gigging rig, though they can certainly be made to work. For just a little bit more at $650, the Fender Bassbreaker 15 does offer an EL84 driven tube sound, which is pretty cool. Obviously, I think it's not the best use of money compared to all the effects and tones you get out of these others, but if you're just a play through one amp kind of guy and are willing to wait a while on getting some pedals to make up for other tones you might want, then it can conceivably be a good option. Moving on to the $1,800 to $2,200 territory. This is the start your own shitty YouTube channel and make covers price point. And you'll notice here is where I start to deviate in the price points for guitar and amp rigs. So guitars, I would stick between $800 and $900. This opens up to the 7-string Iron Label series from Ibanez. You can get some of the Jackson Pro stuff, some really nice Schecters. If you're looking in the extended range stuff, Agile becomes a really great option at this point. I've played my Agile a lot here. Of course, you do have to go through a different kind of supply chain than you would normally, but they offer a lot of great stuff for great value. Gives you a lot of options in terms of different bridge types, extended scale lengths, finishes, if you're worried about the aesthetics. You got Ola England Solar Company, as well as some other more budget friendly, at least in that price tier, startup companies from other guitar players as well. So this one really, it's like, what do you want? And of course you've got the vintage stuff as well from higher end Epiphone, lower end Gibsons. The amplifier or modeling rig between $1,100 and $1,200 is really where the sweet spot lies for me. This is where you can buy a product and get practically all the tones under the sun if you know how to use it. This is the Helix LT, the Fractal AX8. Hopefully the successor will be in this sort of price tier as well. Boss GT100. And if you do anything similar to what I do in terms of direct recording, or if you want to take this on a gig and just plug it straight into the PA system, I think that's the way to go for most guitarists going forward, as long as you're comfortable with the kind of setup and stuff that we cover here. For a little bit less, if you want a legitimate tube head, you got stuff like the Marshall DSL-40 CR at $750, or even a 1x12 of the 6505 at $800. And with the remaining money, you've got stuff for, you know, pedals you can put together, something with a Boss Super Overdrive or a Tube Screamer if you prefer, all these other things. So that does give you an amp platform if that's more up your alley. You also gain the ability to actually start looking at some half stacks with the lower wattage models of the 6505 or the 5153. A lot of this stuff is using like EL84s and not the big boy tubes like EL34s or 6L6s. But you could conceivably buy an amp head for 600 and a cabinet for 500 that doesn't give you much room for anything else, which is where the combo amps can still be a better value, but it's another one of those things that you can grow into that a little more. The Bass Breaker 45 is 1,000. The Blackstar HT Stage 60 2x12 is 1050. So if you're looking more of a British inspired tone, and a lot of 2x12 cabs for $500, $600. Or if you're willing to check out the used market a little more, you might even be able to score some of those smaller, you know, higher end type of amplifiers in that price range. So keep an eye out on that. That brings us to our final $4,000 price tier. This is the one that is the most lopsided between the two halves. So if you're looking to buy a $2,000 guitar or amp modeler, this one's going to be a bit skewed. At $1,500 bucks, you're looking at some of the more reasonable Gibson lines like the Les Paul Studio, some of the SGs, and it's hard to recommend all of those based on some of their quality control issues, but that is opening you up into some name brand recognizable guitars. You are looking at the higher end lines of stuff like Agile and some of the other less mainstream models. Really lots of options in terms of pickups and exotic finishes and all that good stuff. As well as set neck Jacksons, which are among my favorite guitars. And aside from some of those specialized higher end guitars, you also see a lot of signatures in this price range. So like the LTD Hetfield Snakebite or the Vulture, or I know like Misha Mansour has his Pro Series of Jacksons, pretty sure that's in that price range. Things like the Meshuggah M8M, or the higher end of some of those smaller startup companies we were talking about. That's a pretty sweet spot for guitars, I think, where anywhere after that, it's really going to come down to personal preference. Is it worth to have these exotic woods for you? Is it worth to have these hand-wound pickups or a certain body style? So after that, it becomes so subjective that I can't even commentate on it. For the amp modelers and amp rigs, at $2,500 bucks, you're looking at the big boys. These are your Kempers. This is your Axe-FX 3. Although for both of those, they're not really gig ready out of the box, meaning you're going to have to spend more for either a floorboard or already have a setup that can control it via MIDI. But for direct recording stuff, they're the topper. And even for most practicing, you'll be able to use them. But keep in mind, they are not necessarily like tour ready right then and there. $2,500 also gets you a 6505 plus half stack and still gives you plenty of money to put together a full-fledged pedal board, including an overdrive, 6 to 8 more Boss pedals, depending on what you spend on those. So if you want a traditional amp rig and you're a metalhead, obviously it's a go-to, but some of the more mass manufactured amplifiers like that, it's feasible in this price range. For some of the higher end, you know, I guess not quite boutique brands, but borderline, a Friedman Runt and 2x12 will run you about this price point, and stuff like the Mini Rectifier or Recto Verb plus a 2x12, maybe a couple pedals as well will run that way. The best bang for your buck, in my opinion, for the real amp sound would be a Mark V 25 and a 2x12. Not quite as many pedals that you can throw in there, but you actually need less with that amp, in my opinion. Very capable. Obviously, I love the Mark series of amps. I really debated getting a Mark V 25 before I found my Mark IV. And again, that 2x12 and a few extra pretties will give you so many tones that can work from anywhere from classic rock, super clean jazz sounds to modern down-tuned metal. So I think that one's like a great thing to go for if digital's not your thing. For many viewers in this audience, though, I know for a fact digital is your thing. So we'll be discussing that, and this will definitely be more wallet friendly, because I know some of you are like, do you think I have $4,000 lying around to spend on this stuff? No, not really. Not for most people. So for the software side, this is for those of you that want to record at home, especially if you're just getting started. Don't mind bringing a laptop as your direct rig, because as I've shown with a lot of these plugins, they really do sound that good. And this assumes you already have a guitar. If you're looking for the equivalent of that, then I've already kind of discussed those price points. But for a software budget of $200, this also assumes you already have a laptop or something. I think a lot of people do, most people do, or have an iPad or something that will get this to work. For $100, you can get a capable interface. It's not going to be the best. It's not going to have the most options. You probably won't be able to reamp out of it, do a bunch of signal splitting stuff, but you've got the budget stuff from Line 6, Focusrite, Behringer. I have a lot of experience with the Focusrite, Scarlett series. They work well. Some good preamps for plugging a guitar directly in, as well as using it with phantom power for a microphone, though plenty of other good options. And that gives you another $100 to spend on a legitimate audio workstation program. Or you can even save some more money, go with a free version. You can get some free drum samples that sound fine, and plenty of free guitar effects, as we've talked about here. I think the sweet spot lies in getting some of the built-in sounds on an audio workstation program like Cubase. It's got some pretty damn good synth stuff. The drum samples are not bad at all if you know how to work with them, and it gives you all the players to work with those. And then you download some amp software like the stuff that I've discussed before, and you're ready to rock. For those that would like a few more features and some more authenticity to their sound, a $250 interface is another good price point. Stuff like the Scarlett Focusrite 6i6 offers more of that multi-channel monitoring and a little bit better preamps, although there's some competitors that do a good job as well. Still, I'd say it's about the same price point for your audio workstation program, whatever you go with, and that gives you about $150 to play with premium amplifier plugins. Obviously, I really like the Neural DSP stuff. I like the Mercurial stuff. And there's plenty of nickel and dime guitar plugins here and there. Audio Salt's got a few of those, Vatatarinoff. So whatever you like in terms of amp tones, you can kind of put together a huge palette of amp sounds and spend less than what some pedals cost. And finally, the $800 tier. This sticks with the $250 to $350 interface, although you can definitely spend a lot more on that. If you're on the Mac side of things, the UAD interfaces are just outrageous, but they do have a lot of features. So if that does do what you want, and especially on the more budget-friendly stuff, then that's totally cool. But I find for most people that do this at home, that's probably your ceiling for what you'll actually need. This gives you a little more wiggle room to buy some higher-end audio workstation programs like Logic Pro X on Mac. It gives you some upgrades to Cubase, some more plugins to play with wherever you're at. And that gives you in the neighborhood of $300 to $350 for amp plugins for those of you that are guitarists. You're looking at a couple Neural DSP plugins if you like the Fortin and the Pliny stuff. Reaccess from Mercurial's $80, and that is a ass ton of sounds in that thing. Anywhere between $50 and $200 for the Easy Mix plugins if you specifically want something to sound like an artist or track with. Or you can, spend a little bit more for Helix Native for $400 if you like the Helix sound and you want it in your plugin form. And I would say that about does it for this extremely long video. I went way longer than I intended to, but hopefully this gave you some valuable insight into actually how I go about this. There's no set in stone rules, but this is my mathematically inclined approach to it, whether I'm commissioning a custom guitar or just picking up something that's for jamming and some demos. So yeah, any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. Hopefully this was mostly educational and will help you buy some new stuff in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.